Well, Nick, thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you to Camden for hosting this. I'm going to talk about Ukraine, Russia, and a bit about American policy. But let me start first with Ukraine before I get to the conflict. And the first point I guess I would make, I'd actually go back to, let's see, have to get the technology right here. Let me go back and illustrate the first point with an anecdote. When I was in Ukraine, I used to do themed dinners where you'd bring together a group of people to talk about something. And one night, I think it was in the summer of 1998, we brought together a group to talk about Ukraine foreign and security policy, national security. And we had a couple of deputy ministers, some people from the presidential administration, some members of the parliament, and some think tankers. And about halfway through the dinner, I posed the question, what today is the single greatest threat to Ukrainian national security? And there was a pause, and then a voice at the end of the table says, Ukrainians. And there was laughter, but then there was actually a very interesting and a very insightful conversation, the point of which was Ukraine's problem was the inability of the country to set an objective, have a strategy to get there, and then implement that strategy. And that was a more difficult problem than any external threat. And that's the first point I want to make about Ukraine today. Ukraine is fragile, it's vulnerable, it's weak, first and foremost because of bad decisions made by 20 years of Ukraine's political leaders. These guys here, these are the first 4 presidents of Ukraine. And leaders they avoided decisions on economic reform because they feared the political consequences. Leaders who sometimes were engaged in infighting with their prime minister and their governments couldn't work. Or they were engaged with fighting with the parliament. Or in the case of the gentleman in the center there, Mr. Yanukovych, they were far more interested in personal corruption than the national interest. By some estimates, in his 4 years as president, which ended a year ago, Mr. Yanukovych stole $10 billion from the Ukrainian treasury. Now, these bad decisions had consequences for Ukraine, and I'll give you 2 examples. If you go back to 1990, the year before the Soviet Union collapsed, and you look at Ukraine and you look at its next door neighbor to the west, Poland, those 2 countries had roughly equal gross domestic product per capita. 23 years later, GDP per capita in Poland was more than triple that of Ukraine. And that reflects the fact that in Poland, the leadership, they made the tough decisions in the 1980s and the 1990s, and the Ukrainians didn't. And the Ukrainian people have paid the price for that. One other example, at one point in Ukraine when I was there, we had a major international energy company, and they basically were leaving Ukraine. And they said, because our corporate philosophy is to go and find mega fields. And we can't find mega fields here, but we're interested in oil and gas. Ukraine is probably the most energy inefficient country in the world. It uses far more energy than it needs, but a big part of that energy comes from natural gas. At the time, Ukraine was producing 18 to 19 billion cubic meters of gas per year. That was about 1/4 of its needs. And this company said, we spent a lot of money. We spent $2 million doing the research. We went out and looked at the gas fields. Ukraine should be capable of producing 30 to 35 billion cubic meters of gas per year. This shows gas production in Ukraine. It basically stayed flat. And that was because of bad decisions due to corruption. It was due to decisions that basically created no incentive for additional gas production. And so for most of this period, the #1 source of Ukrainian gas has been Russia. It's pretty problematic right now. So the first thing to know about Ukraine is it's in a bad situation, first and foremost because self-inflicted wounds inflicted by poor leadership. The second point about Ukraine is set aside the conflict in eastern Ukraine. These 2 guys, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the prime minister on the left, Petro Poroshenko, the prime minister on the right, they have a huge list of problems. Not even thinking about eastern Ukraine. It's economic reform. It's reforming the energy sector. It's decentralizing political power. In early 2013, well before the crisis, the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine, the entire cabinet spent 3 hours discussing a bridge project in central downtown Kyiv. In a rational society, that would be for the Kyiv City Council, not for the cabinet. They need to decentralize power. They need to address corruption. It's one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and that will be the measurement by which most people judge their performance in Ukraine. They've got a lot to do, and if they don't apply attention to these issues, Ukraine, unfortunately, will remain an economic basket case for the next years or even decades. And they've got to work quickly. This shows Ukraine's foreign exchange reserves, now down to about $6 billion, about enough for maybe 6 weeks of imports. Most countries, if you fall below 6 to 8 months, go into panic mode. Now, there is a program, the International Monetary Fund is putting together a package with help from the United States and the European Union. The question is to provide these funds, but it's going to be dependent, and it should be dependent, on Ukraine taking the economic reforms that they haven't taken for the last 25 years to get the economy into a normal position where it can begin growing in a couple of years. The last 3 or 4 months, we've seen some positive signs. My sense is, though, that in the International Monetary Fund and even in the US government, there's not yet full confidence that they've got that important critical mass of reforms. But that's going to be important, because if Ukraine doesn't do that, not only are they going to lose access to Western funds, but I fear they're going to lose the support of Western governments, and most importantly, they'll likely lose the support of the Ukrainian people. So let me shift track now and talk about what was an internal Ukrainian conflict from November of 2013. It began when President Yanukovych decided he was not going to sign an association agreement, which was largely an economic arrangement with the European Union. But it quickly went beyond that. Protests began over that, but then early use of force by the authorities brought about a backlash from the public, and it morphed into a general protest against the corruption, dissatisfaction in general. And 2 years, or a year ago today, on the 21st, Mr. Yanukovych left. Now, in the Russian version, he left because of a clever CIA plot that put together to force him out using neo-Nazis. I think what really happened was, in the last several days before he left, he authorized use of force. About 100 demonstrators on the streets of Kyiv were killed, many by snipers. And I think he realized his position was untenable and left on his own. In any case, within a couple of days, the Parliament of Ukraine, still functioning, appointed an acting president and an acting cabinet. And they very quickly made known that their primary goal in foreign policy was to draw closer to the European Union, to sign the association agreement that Yanukovych had declined to sign, and pull closer to the European Union. And within a couple days, these guys show up in Crimea. The Ukrainian term for these guys is little green men. They are, by the way, when you see the videos, by the way they handle their weapons, they are clearly professional soldiers. They're wearing Russian combat fatigues, but they have no insignia, which actually is a violation of the law of war. On March 3rd, a year ago, at a press conference, President Putin is asked, "Are these guys Russian soldiers?" And he says, no, they're just local self-defense groups. The reporter then said, but Mr. President, they're wearing Russian combat fatigues. And he says, well, you can get those in any surplus store around the post-Soviet space. The journalist did not have the sense to ask the follow-up question, which should have been, well, Mr. President, do they also get those armored combat vehicles at those same stores? In any case, within a matter of days, these guys had taken over Crimea. And literally within 2 weeks, you had the Russian parliament annexing Crimea. About 3 weeks from the time these guys showed up to it's a part of Russia. But it didn't begin there, or it didn't end there. In April, you had in Donetsk and Luhansk, in the far eastern part of the country, little green men began to show up. Now, to be clear, most of the separatist action in those two provinces of Ukraine were local separatists. But they had a huge amount of funding, arms, and organization provided by Moscow. So in April a year ago, the so-called Prime Minister of the Donetsk People's Republic and the so-called Defense Minister both had apartments in Moscow. So there was a fairly high degree of Russian organization here. Now, over the course of April and May, they took a good part of what's called the Donbass, that area between Donetsk and Luhansk. And it's only in June that the Ukrainian military begins to push back. In some ways, fairly clumsily. They used heavy weapons, and I think they probably inadvertently killed a lot of civilians in the process. But by June, they're actually pushing back and compressing the area controlled by the separatists. And you begin then to see heavy weapons, tanks, armored personnel carriers, surface-to-air missile systems flowing from the Russian border into eastern Ukraine, including this system here. It's actually mounted on a truck. This is a Buk SA-11 surface-to-air missile system. This picture was taken in the evening after Malaysian Air 17 was shot down. And if you look very carefully, you can see this launcher normally has 4 rockets, one's gone. This truck is on its way back to Russia. Lots of evidence that the Russians were providing significant equipment to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian military, however, nevertheless continues to make progress to the point where in early August, most people are saying the Ukrainian army may be able to win this fight. And on or about August 23rd, the Russians react by sending in regular units of the Russian army, and they hammer the Ukrainians. The estimate we heard, I was in Kyiv in January, we heard that the Ukrainians believe between 50 and 70% of the armor that they had engaged in Donetsk and Luhansk were destroyed by the Russian attack. And on September 5, President Poroshenko sues for peace because he has no choice. So you have your first Minsk ceasefire agreement worked out on September 5. The ceasefire doesn't hold. The Russians don't implement any of the terms. I think that there were probably violations on both sides. Intense fighting. This is the Donetsk airport terminal. That terminal actually was brand new in 2012. It was opened for the Euro Cup games in Ukraine in 2012. It was the scene of pretty brutal fighting for about 4 months before it fell to the separatists and the Russians. Again, I think there were ceasefire on both sides. My guess watching from Washington is more of the violations came on the Russian and the separatist side because of the map. This is what the separatists and the rebels held, and I use Russians because I think at this point there were Russians in eastern Ukraine and that there are Russians in eastern Ukraine now. What they held on September 4 on the eve of the ceasefire. That's what they held on September 11. That's what they held on November 2nd. And that's what they held on February 11th, just about 10 days ago, on the eve of the second negotiations in Minsk. And so you've had this movement forward. Now, in Minsk, Chancellor Merkel, French President Hollande bring Putin and Poroshenko together. They do a 15-hour marathon negotiation, and they come up with terms of an agreement, a ceasefire and an arrangement. I think most analysts looking at it were very skeptical. Can this be made to work? Not only, the political arrangement calls for a negotiation between Kyiv and Donetsk and Luhansk. It's going to be very, very difficult. But can they even begin to get the ceasefire? The ceasefire was supposed to kick in 2.5 days after the agreement was reached. And what you immediately see when you have 2.5 days before a ceasefire is the sides crank up the fighting. And you had particularly gruesome fighting around a place called Debaltseve. The ceasefire supposedly comes into effect at midnight last Saturday, Kyiv time, and it doesn't have any impact at all. This picture here, this is from Debaltseve last Sunday. This is a guy by the name of Graham Phillips. He's regarded as a pro-separatist, pro-Russian reporter. I use reporter in quotation marks. The picture here is interesting, though, because you look at the 3 tanks there. Those are tanks. The separatists claim we get tanks and artillery because we capture them from the Ukrainian army. These are tanks, and you can tell by the reactive armor on the turret there and the gun sights up there that only exist in the Russian army. And there's lots of evidence like this that the Russian military was fighting. Debaltseve fell on Wednesday. And this today is what the map looks like. This part of here, Debaltseve fell. Now, one question was, is it stopping there? Unfortunately, in the last couple of days, there have been reports of continued fighting moving up that road there and then down to Mariupol. And I think a lot of people are worried that Mariupol may be a target because that would involve, I think, some very bloody and very gruesome city fighting. So Minsk II doesn't seem to have worked, and that does raise a question, what are the Russian objectives here? Most people looked at the Minsk II agreement and said, this is hugely disadvantageous to Ukraine. It favors the separatists, but the Russians and the separatists continued the fighting right through the ceasefire of Minsk II. So it does bring up some questions. What is Vladimir Putin? What was the Kremlin trying to achieve? I think there's one piece of it here. Not the best map, but blue is basically the European Union. Red is the Eurasian Economic Union, now called just the Eurasian Union. That's Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Armenia. I think Mr. Putin really would like to have Ukraine in this grouping. He sees this as an alternative to the European Union. Ukraine said no, and that's not recent. Viktor Yanukovych back in 2011 said, I don't want to join the Eurasian Union. I prefer to associate with the European Union. And then I think there's a pretty obvious reason for this. If you look at the combined economies of the Eurasian Economic Union, led by Russia, it's between $2 and $2.5 trillion a year. If you look at the European Union's economy, you're talking $17 to $18 trillion. Do the math. That is not a hard decision. So I think Putin was unhappy, and then when it was clear that Ukraine was not going to come east, part of what we're seeing is designed to make it very, very difficult for Ukraine to move west, to destabilize the government, to keep it off balance, to create chaos in eastern Ukraine so that Petro Poroshenko and Arsen Yatsenyuk have trouble not only fulfilling the association agreement with the European Union, but also dealing with the very difficult economic and political reform challenges that they have at home. What are the motives here? I think there are a couple. One motive is great power. I don't think Mr. Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union, even though at one point he said that it was one of the great catastrophes of the 20th century that the Soviet Union collapsed. But I think he understands rebuilding the Soviet Union means that the Russian economy has to subsidize everybody else, and the Russian economy does not want to do that. But what he does want is a sphere of influence. He wants deference from neighbors to Russian demands, and that means you don't join NATO. And I think as Ukraine is finding out now, because there were very few prospects a year and a half ago of Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon, you don't get too close to the European Union. But I think it's also as much, if not more, about domestic politics. Russia and Ukraine have the intertwined history, culture that goes back centuries. And I think for Mr. Putin at home, trying to bring Ukraine back towards Russia plays well with his conservative political base at home. Now, I'd put a qualifier there is polls in Russia consistently show that the Russians do not want to see the Russian army fighting in Ukraine. But a second part of this is this, and you've already seen one image. This is the Bolotnaya protest in December 2011. I think that made the Kremlin very nervous. And the worry here is that you had large demonstrations in Ukraine in November through February of last year. They brought down a government, they put in a new government. If that succeeds, I think the concern in the Kremlin goes way up. That becomes a model attractive to Russians. And so part of what we're maybe seeing in Russia is simply an effort to try to make this current government in Kyiv, which came out of the Maidan protest, fail. I hope that's not right. I think it may well be right, but I hope that's not right because that suggests, there is no settlement possible that would be agreeable to the Ukrainians. So let me step back now just from the Ukraine question and talk a little bit about the fact that I think actually the West has a broader Russia problem here. It's not just about Ukraine. First of all, the Kremlin has, over the course of the last year, torn up the cardinal rule of the post-war European security order. And that was you do not use military force to change borders or to take territory from other countries. They've taken Crimea, they're using military force in eastern Ukraine. But there's a second part of this is one of the philosophies that you hear espoused by the Kremlin for the last 4 or 5 years is Russia has this right that they claim to defend ethnic Russians or Russian speakers wherever they are and whatever their citizenship. And you've already seen a version of this map here, but what does that mean for Kazakhstan? A quarter of its population is ethnic Russian, and as has been pointed out, what does it mean for Estonia and Latvia, both members of NATO, where again about a quarter of the population is ethnic Russian? Some of you may have seen the Daily Show, I think it was May of last year, where somebody pointed out it may also be a problem for Brighton Beach, but I worry tend about more of these areas here. But you combine this, though, with what you have coming out of Moscow and coming out of President Putin is huge antipathy towards NATO. If you have a chance to see the speech he gave on March 18 last year on annexation of Crimea, it's almost a rant against NATO. And so I think that does create a concern. Do I think the Russian army is going to invade Estonia? Probably not. But I do have a concern that if the Russians take away that the hybrid war that they've been conducting in Ukraine is successful, do they then conclude that they could try something like that? Do little green men show up in Estonia? It's also been, I think, worrisome in the course of the last year is this. This is a British air fighter escorting a Russian Bear bomber off the coast of Britain. What NATO reports is these kinds of flights have tripled during the crisis compared to the previous years. And they're also much more provocative, and sometimes they're just dangerous. Reports from Swedish and Danish air traffic control of at least 2 instances where Russian intelligence aircraft turned off their transponders, did not show up on civilian radars, and resulted in near misses with Scandinavian aircraft. So the behavior is not only provocative, but it's risky. So let me turn back now on the Western response. And let me start by saying, why should you care? I mean, I care. I spent 3 years in the country, and then I worked on a lot. But if you look at the American foreign policy agenda, you've got to worry about ISIS, Syria, Iraq, an Iran nuclear program in China. Why should we worry about Ukraine? And I'll give you 3 reasons that I think or hope will be persuasive. One is, over the course of the last 20 years, Ukraine has actually been a fairly good partner on international relations when we needed their help. 2 examples. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine had on its territory the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal. It included 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads, either targeted or targetable at the United States. And in 1994, largely at U.S. behest, Nick and I worked a lot on this, Ukraine agreed to give up that arsenal. So the warheads went back to Russia, where they were dismantled. The missile silos, the missiles, and the bombers were destroyed in Ukraine. That thing is called the Claw. It's provided with what was called the Nunn-Lugar Assistance Program, and it's chopping up a Ukrainian blackjack bomber, roughly the equivalent of a RB-1. They did that largely at our behest. In 2003, after American troops reached Baghdad, there was a big effort to get countries to contribute forces to the coalition stabilization force. For about a year and a half, Ukraine had the 4th largest contingent after the United States, Britain, Poland, and then you had Ukraine. Not because they had any interest in Iraq, but because the United States asked. And I think that merits some support. The second reason I think we owe them some support goes back to 1994, and again, something we worked on, the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, in which the United States, Russia, and Britain committed to observe the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, agreed not to use force or threaten to use force. Russia has violated all those commitments, and I believe that imposes a certain obligation on the United States to respond, as well as to Britain. Now, we used the term assurances very carefully. We told the Ukrainians it's not guarantees. Guarantees is what NATO gets. Guarantees means the 82nd Airborne. Assurances is something less, but I do think it means that we owe the Ukrainians some measure of support in the current struggle. And then the third reason I think we should respond goes back to this perhaps broader threat to European security. If the Russians conclude, if we don't push back and the Russians conclude that what they're doing in eastern Ukraine is a successful tactic, are they tempted to apply it somewhere else in a place where we have to care by treaty? So how's the West responded? Really, I think I'd break down the U.S. response into 3 ways. First, support for Ukraine. Second, bolstering NATO. And then third, punishing Russia with the goal of getting Russia to change its policy. I'll take each one in turn. Support for Ukraine. A lot of political support. Vice President Biden's been to Kyiv 3 times in the last 13 months. Also European allies trying to bolster internationally the status of Poroshenko and his government. Economic support, the US and the EU working very carefully with the IMF to get a program together that, if Ukraine does the necessary reforms, will ensure they have the funding to get through those. A third part, which has already been touched on, the question of providing lethal military assistance to Ukraine. I favor providing some defensive arms. We're not talking about American troops, certainly, and we're not talking about advanced offensive weapons. But I was with a group in Kyiv and in Kramatorsk, which is the Ukrainian front headquarters, back in January. The one thing they desperately need are light anti-tank weapons. The arguments of those like me who favor that boil down to, we understand the Ukrainian army is not going to defeat the Russian army. But the question is, can you drive the cost of fighting, can you drive the cost of escalation to the Russians up to the point where they conclude that the costs of this warfare are greater than the gains? And it gets back to one thing, the Russian government, President Putin, they've been very careful to hide the fact of this war and casualties from the Russian people. And you hear things, in some cases, which are disgraceful. Soldiers buried at night. I heard a story about a Russian who lost his leg in Donetsk in August and was told if he told people how he lost his leg fighting in Ukraine, he would lose forever his disability pension. So those of us who support this say, that suggests Mr. Putin may not care that much about dead Russian soldiers, but maybe he does care about the impact of that on his public standing. Now, there's another argument, which I think you heard earlier this morning, is that if we do this, if the United States does that, the Russians will escalate. And certainly the Russians have the ability to escalate. They can pour in more tanks, they can pour in more troops. I don't think that escalation, though, is so easy. First of all, because they're at a point now where escalation is going to mean more visible and overt involvement by the Russian army. It'll be visible both at home, that's a problem for Mr. Putin, but it'll also be visible internationally in a way that may, in fact, encourage support for further sanctions. So yes, the Russians have escalation options, but I think it's a mistake to say they're automatically going to do that. There are some risks and costs. The second part of the response, bolster NATO. This is the Wales summit, and it took decisions that for 20 years NATO didn't think it was going to have to make. So you have, for example, now for the first time since the 1990s, last April, you have forward deployed American and other forces in the Baltic states and Poland. And those forces are designed to do a couple of things. One is to reassure those governments that there is, in fact, backing to the NATO commitment to their defense. And the second point is to make sure that that red line that separates Russia from NATO is, in the minds of the Russians, very clear, very bright, and very red. The third part of the strategy is to impose economic sanctions on Russia with the goal of getting Russia to change its approach towards Ukraine. And we've heard some of the economic damage that's being done. I think there's a combination of the sanctions with the falling price of oil have done significant damage to the Russian economy. And Daniel expressed some of the impacts earlier today. This is just one of them here, is that despite the Russian central bank spending tens of billions of dollars to defend the ruble between July and January lost about 50% of its value against the dollar. Now, the theory and the hope here is that these economic sanctions, as they begin to have a greater impact, at some point that the Russian population becomes uneasy, and this erodes support for Mr. Putin. Will that happen? I think there's a chance it will happen. I can't guarantee it. I have colleagues at Brookings who argue the other way and say, no, Putin will just use that to rally people, appeal to their patriotism, and push back. And we'll see in the coming months how this works out. I would argue that even if we're not sure that this is going to work, that Russian behavior has been so egregious that there should be punishment from the West. So let me just conclude three quick scenarios. What might happen in Ukraine? The desirable scenario, which I think is highly unlikely, is that Minsk II actually gets implemented. That there, in fact, a ceasefire now takes maybe 10 days later than it could. There's a political settlement. And Ukraine has, and President Poroshenko has some breathing space to focus on his very difficult reform agenda. I hope that will happen. I think the chances are unlikely, and the last 10 days suggest that that's not likely to happen. The second scenario, which I think is the worst scenario, is that in fact the ceasefire breaks down and you have a resumption of all-out fighting on par with what you saw last August, early September. And that's going to mean many more dead on both sides. I think that is probably the second most likely scenario. The third scenario, and perhaps the most likely, is that you simply have what happened between September and January. No true ceasefire, no real fighting in places, conversations, but no real progress on a political settlement. And I worry that in fact may be Mr. Putin's goal, is just that amount of chaos and instability, because that's going to make it much harder for Mr. Poroshenko and his government to worry about the problems that they have in Kyiv in terms of reform and dealing with the European Union. But if that in fact is the Russian goal, it may well be hard to find this settlement. So just to sum up, I think what the US strategy ought to be here when we're talking about Ukraine, it has 4 parts. Part number 1 is financial and economic support with the IMF and European Union to Ukraine as long as they're doing the necessary reforms. Part number 2 is sustaining and applying additional economic sanctions on Russia with the objective of getting Russia to change its behavior. Part number 3, I would argue, would be providing now defensive arms to the Ukrainian military so that they can take away, if not the military option, at least the cheap military option from Russia, and hopefully turn Russia towards a negotiated settlement. And then part number 4, which I think is out there, is in fact the terms of a settlement which I believe the Ukrainians are prepared to concede enough that would allow Vladimir Putin to claim victory if he wants a way out. But that's the big question. Does Mr. Putin, does the Kremlin want a way out of this? Thanks very much.